We'll begin by going through 3 basic guidelines for using color in PowerPoint. The first guideline is to use color strategically to engage audiences and highlight important parts of your message. Presentations that are entirely black and white are boring and will not engage anyone. Make full use of the color options that you have. The second guideline is to use color to draw your audience's attention to important parts of each slide. Let's look at an example. Here we have a graph that's in black and white. If we showed this graph to an audience, they might not know where to look or what conclusions to draw. A better way to use color in this graph would be to highlight the bar that's of the most importance. So here in this graph, we're highlighting a bar and showing the audience where they should focus their attention. The final rule of using color is to be consistent with colors throughout the presentation. Use a color palette. This will serve to unify your presentation and also unify similar elements and related topics. We'll spend the rest of this lesson discussing color palettes in more detail. Now, I'm not a graphic designer, and you don't have to be one either to select colors that are impactful and visually appealing. I'll go through some tips and tricks for choosing the best color palettes. For starters, I recommend avoiding the default Microsoft color palette. There's nothing necessarily wrong with any of these colors, but they are a bit boring. Since most people use the default color palette, many slide decks look alike. You can use a different color palette to stand out from the crowd. This is also an opportunity to set a tone for your presentation. Do you want to use bright and cheery colors or darker colors? Do you want to use different shades of blue, or do you like using colors from several different color families? There are so many options that it can be overwhelming, so let's go through the basic contents of a color palette. When choosing colors, I recommend that you choose no more than 5 colors for use in your color palette, in addition to black and white. In general, you won't need more than 2 or 3 colors per slide, but a couple more colors can be useful when you're displaying complicated graphs or multifaceted ideas. Here's an example of a 5-color palette. The contents of this palette include a dark color and a light color. Having a dark and a light color in your palette is a good idea because these can serve as background color options for your slide. Dark background colors are usually useful when slides will be presented in a large dark room, like for a keynote address. Light background colors are useful when you're presenting in a smaller, more brightly lit room. This is because dark colors can look washed out in brightly lit rooms, making it difficult to read white text on a dark background. I'll occasionally use both dark and light backgrounds in the same presentation, as it can sometimes be useful to use a dark background when presenting dark images like confocal microscopy images or dark photographs. When choosing between a dark and light background, think about where you are presenting your slides and the tone you'd like to set with them. Dark backgrounds are often more dramatic than light backgrounds. In addition to using dark and light colors as background colors, they can also be used as text colors on white and black backgrounds, respectively. You'll notice that I have 3 other colors here. I usually have 3 colorful options, some of which would contrast well on a light background and some of which would contrast well on a dark background. This is important so that you have contrasting options for both types of backgrounds as you are developing your slide deck. These more colorful options are useful for adding emphasis to text to highlight certain points. They are also used for shapes, icons, graphs, tables, and diagrams. When choosing colors, I recommend that you choose no more than 4 colors for use in your color palette, in addition to black and gray. In general, you won't need more than 2 or 3 colors per slide, but a 4th color can be useful when you are displaying complicated graphs and multifaceted ideas. Here's an example of how you might use these colors for a light background or a dark background slide. Here is another example of a color palette that could be useful for a slide deck. You'll see that it has many of the same features as the last color palette, a dark color and a light color, and then 3 contrasting colors that can be used for other items. While developing a color palette, it's important to keep in mind the importance of contrast. You should use contrasting colors to your advantage to ensure that your text is easily readable and that colors pop. Here's an example of 4 slides with the same background colors at different tints. Outside of the background color, nothing changes on this slide. You can see that the light background and dark text is the easiest to read, whereas the dark background with the dark text is the most difficult to read. This is because the dark text contrasts on the light colored background, obviously. Similarly, white text contrasts well on dark backgrounds. The lighter that we make the backgrounds in this example, the more difficult it is to read the slides. This is again, of course, due to the contrasting nature of the colors. Another important reason to use contrasting colors is that colors with contrast are more distinguishable to people with vision impairment or color blindness. Approximately 9% of all men have some form of color blindness, and 0.5% of all women have some form of color blindness. This means that if you're giving a presentation to 100 people in a room, there's a good chance that 9 of these people will have color blindness. The most common forms of color blindness are protanopia and deuteranopia. These conditions are often called red-green color blindness. As you can see, red-green color blindness is associated with difficulty discerning red from green. The difficulty with discernment primarily comes from a lack of contrast between these colors. Let's look at some examples to give you an idea of how slides might look to someone who's colorblind. When we use low contrast colors like the ones that I've showed you that are difficult to read, you can see that to someone who's colorblind, they are even more difficult to read and comprehend. In contrast, when we use high contrast colors, it's likely easier for someone with color blindness to see the colors. When you compare these slides directly, you can see that the ones made with high contrast colors are far easier to look at and see the colors. There are several free tools for checking the contrast of your colors. See the lesson handout for a full list of websites that can be used. For most of these websites, you would save your slides as pictures and upload them, which will analyze the pictures and give you information about color contrast based on an algorithm. A lower-tech method of checking contrast is to print or print preview your slides in black and white. This will quickly make apparent if your colors don't contrast enough, as they'll likely be difficult to read in black and white. One more note about color blindness. No matter the contrast, red and green are difficult to distinguish for people with color blindness. Avoid using red or green to highlight or focus audience attention. Finally, you may be wondering how you actually select colors that are complementary to each other when developing a color palette. There are lots of courses available that cover color theory, but most color theory is beyond the scope of this course. Now, since I'm not a graphic designer, I prefer to use color palettes that are freely available to the public through a variety of websites like Adobe Color Wheel, which is shown here. Most of these websites will allow you to download the color values for a color palette.